Hello students and welcome back. This module 4 is going to be the last module for this course, PGE 515, and it is titled Learning Assessments. At the end of this module, you should be able to define assessments, differentiate between assessment of learning and assessment as learning, list types of assessments, explain why we assess students, explain what is assessment for and of learning. Discuss the following: cultism, examination malpractices, poor job performances as indices of poor curriculum implementation. List causes of cultism, examination malpractices, and poor job performances. And lastly, you will be able to mention the level of performance. What then is learning assessments? What exactly do we mean when we talk about assessment of student learning? At the level of a subject or a course, assessment provides important data on the depth and the breadth of students' learning. It must be noted here that assessment is more than just grading. It is about measuring the progress of students' learning. Thus, assessment is defined by Harris and Hodges in 1995 as the process of gathering data to better understand the strengths and weaknesses of student learning. Assessment plays a very important role in the process of learning and also in motivating the learners. The types of assessment tasks that we ask our students to do determine how students will approach the learning task and what student behaviors they will use. In the words of higher education scholars like John Biggs, he says, and I quote, "What and how students learn depends to a major extent on how they think they will be assessed." Please take note of that. There are different types of assessments, right? If you go through literature, some have categorized assessment under 6 types, some 7 types. But for the purpose of this class, we are going to look at assessment under 3 broad categories: formative assessment, summative assessment, and student metacognition. Summative assessments, we are going to start with summative, which is also known as assessment of learning. Assessment of learning. The purpose of this kind of assessment is usually summative. All right, is a total sum of the progress a student have made over a specific period of time. All right, it's usually the result of the assessment is usually made public, and the major decisions are taken after this kind of assessment. For instance, the promotion exam will inform of if a student is fit enough to progress to the next class or has to repeat that class in order to acquire the minimum standard of learning that is expected for the class. It may determine whether a student gets admitted into a university after taking the Joint Admission and Matriculation Board exam. It may determine whether a student passes a course or the student has failed. So all these are summative assessments. All right. For summative assessment, teachers have the responsibility of reporting student learning accurately and fairly, and it must be based on objective testing. All right, it must be clear, it must be rational. It's a means of assessment of learning within a specified period of time. Okay, so, and just like I mentioned earlier, it results into a report which is made public, and also upon which a decision about that particular learner is made. All right, now the next is assessment for learning, also known as formative assessments. For formative assessment, emphasis shifts from summative to formative. Assessment for learning happens during the learning, and it is a continuous exercise. In this form of assessment, you want to check what the students understand about the lesson. You want to check what misconceptions they may have. You want to check what gaps exist in their learning at that particular period of time. You also want to check how effective your teaching method is on the learners. And you take steps to correct, to modify, and to bridge the gaps that may exist in the learning process. That is formative assessment, or assessment for learning. How about assessment as learning? That is grouped under the student's metacognition. Through this process of assessment as learning, students are able to learn about themselves as learners. They become aware of how they learn, all right? That is what we call metacognition, knowledge of one's own thought processes. The students will be able to ask themselves and answer themselves about questions like, what is the purpose of learning these concepts and skills? What do I know about this topic? What strategy do I know that will help me to learn this? For instance, the teacher had taught us, had listed 6 causes of a particular illness, for instance, right? So, and the students, by him or herself, have developed a code to aid the recollection of the 6 types or the 6 causes of that particular ailment. That is metacognition. All right? Now, assessment as learning also provides regular and challenging opportunities to practice so that students can become confident, they can become competent. They can ask themselves, oh, how far have I gone with this particular subject? And they will be able to answer it. Oh, I think I have done 80% good to go. Study further so that to make it 100. Oh, I haven't studied much. If you ask me on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say that I am only 3/10 prepared. That is students' metacognition assessment as learning. Let us now briefly look at the differences between assessment for learning and assessment of learning. In assessment for learning, the teacher, the students, and parents are the primary users. All right? Whereas in assessment of learning, teacher, the principal, the supervisor, the program planners, the policy makers are the primary users. You remember, assessment of learning is your summative assessment. Assessment for learning is your formative assessment. All right? In assessment for learning, it takes place during the learning process, whereas assessment of learning takes place after the learning process, at the end of the term, at the end of the semester, at the end of the entire years of study, in primary school, at the end of secondary school, like the West African Examination Council examination. All right? Now, assessment for learning, that is the summative assessment, is used by teachers to identify and respond to students' needs during the lesson, whereas the summative assessment is used to rank and sort students. What do we mean by ranking? Okay, these students had made a distinction, an A. This one made a B. This one's made a C. This one's made a D. All right, that's students ranking. Okay, now summative assessment is the purpose of summative assessment is basically to improve learning. All right, whereas the purpose of formative assessment is to document achievements and to document standards. All right. For formative assessment, the primary motivator is the belief that success is achievable. There's no reason why this pupil should not learn these skills. And you go ahead to do everything possible to ensure that they learn the skills. For formative, the primary motivator, right, is either threat of punishment, or the fear of failure, or the promise of reward. Oh, for those who scored 350 over 400 in this particular exam, they are going to get automatic admission into any university of their choice. That is the primary motivator. That may be a primary motivator for summative assessments. Or if you score a distinction, if you score 70 over 100 in this subject, I'm going to give you 100 naira. At the beginning of every lesson, we have to state clearly the objective of such lesson. Just like we have discussed in curriculum development, there has to be clear, well-written, unambiguous objective for that particular curriculum. The same thing goes for the teaching plan or the lesson plan. The objective of the lesson, what you expect the students to have experienced at the end of the lesson, should have been clearly stated. And we mentioned that these are, the objectives. All right, now we have various kinds of objectives. You have behavioral objective, you have instructional objective. We also have expressive objective. I'm going to take us through briefly each of these. What is behavioral objective? A behavioral objective is a learning outcome stated in measurable terms, which gives direction to the learner's experience and becomes the basis for students' evaluation. For instance, at the end of this lesson, students should be able to analyze, simplify, design, compare, predict, and so on and so forth. These are behavioral, objectives. All right? Now let's look at the next one, expressive objective. When learning activity is specific, but the outcome is open-ended, then you talk about expressive objectives. For instance, you take the entire class on an excursion to visit a zoo, and you now ask each of the pupils to write their experiences about the visits to the zoo. No two experiences will be the same. The number of ideas portrayed by each of these pupils will not be exactly the same. That is expressive objective. All right? Or you know, 10 individuals watch a game of soccer, and you now ask them to discuss the most valuable player, the person that is most valuable to me may not be the person that is most valuable to you. And we may both be right, because this is about perception. All right, so that is expressive objective. How about instructional or learning objective, which oftentimes is what we list in our lesson notes? All right, it describes what the learner will be able to do after completing the instruction or the lesson or the program. For instance, at the end of the lesson, students should be able to list the causes of X, describe the mode of operation of Y, define Z. Do not confuse this with behavioral objective, where the terms like analyze, the terms like discuss was used. All right, now let's move. Hello, distinguished candidates. We have come to the end of PDE 5105. It is important that you take note of this. 1. If you look at the learning objective for each of the module, the video does not completely cover the learning objective. And this is why for every module, the lesson note has been uploaded for further reading. So I expect each and every one of you to fill in the gaps. Then secondly, you are going to be having your tests at a time that will be announced very soon. Your test on PDE 5105. So please inform your friends, inform your colleague to be on the lookout for this test. It is mandatory. Whoever misses the test is going to be scored 0 for that test. And it carries a whole lot of weight towards your final exam. So I wish you all the best, and looking forward to clarifying some issues that you might have with the course. Thank you.